I am not doing a Garbalgist review at the moment. I'm doing one that I've been meaning to do for like 2 weeks of In the Mountains of Madness, which is a biography of H.P. Lovecraft by W. Scott Poole. And this biography, Poole puts a lot of emphasis on Lovecraft's mother and his wife, but not in kind of the way that a lot of biographers do. I've seen a lot of times that Lovecraft's wife, mother in particular, has a lot of times been sort of showcased as, well, she's the reason that he was so weird, and it was her smothering him that caused him to be the way he was. And it's almost like Lovecraft's a weird situation because he was a raging racist, and there's not a whole lot of reason, a whole lot of excuse, because one of his good friends was a very progressive person at this era who was very much into equal rights and all sorts of stuff. So it's not like Lovecraft hadn't heard the arguments about why his viewpoints were so bad. It's just, his whole life is such a strange thing, and people are there is such a cult of not cult of personality, but cult of his works around Lovecraft, that people try desperately to, if not defend him, at least sort of find a reasoning for why he was basically a weird little man. And that's the only way I can describe him, is a weird little man. And he made choices to be a weird little man. It's kind of a weird thing. I've never seen an author of horror short story horror in particular, quite looked at the way he was, except maybe Edgar Allan Poe. There's a whole kind of cult around Poe too, and people are well aware Poe had issues as well, and they kind of tend to skip over the fact he married a 13-year-old, and they tend to skip over the fact that he had a lot of different issues in his life. Lovecraft didn't have issues that way, but he had some major issues when it came to racism and all sorts of really horrible views about things that went a different direction. And it's these two guys, people try to gloss over that an awful lot, or at least try to get around it. And I think one of the ways they try to do that very often is through kind of blaming his mother in some ways, that it's sort of this idea that, well, he wouldn't have been so strange and so backwards and whatever else if his mother had not been the way she was. And I think that is an unfair analysis of his mother. So yes, there was some strangeness there in a way that she did seem like she was a very sort of smothery person and very attached to him in different ways that were kind of weird for the time. But he was kind of weird for the time outside of her. There's really no getting around the fact that this guy was weird outside of his mother. And his mother, when you look at it, there were some really, really legitimate reasons she had some, it seemed like, mental issues, or at least very much emotional issues, because her husband was put in an asylum and died of syphilis. That's what one of the big things with H.P. Lovecraft, they kind of glossed over and hid his entire life, was that he didn't ever really know what his father had happened to him and what had gone on. And that whole situation, she was an abandoned woman herself, and the whole thing always seems very unfairly aimed at his mother. And his wife was downright cool. She, again, in a weird situation that does not quite match up, he was virulently anti-Semitic, but his wife was Jewish. The whole situation, very odd. Like I said, he's just a muddle of contradictions at all points in times, which, once again, weird little man. It seemed like he would have liked nothing better to do with his life than to have had a steady stream of money, because he never wanted to have a job, and ride around on bicycles with his group of little boys club friends and look at old architecture. That really seemed to be what his entire life he would have been happy with. And his little boys club is even partially what seemed to have ruined his marriage, too, because they made it very clear they didn't want his wife involved, didn't like her being an interloper here. She was just as smart as everybody else was, it seems here. She seems like she was quite nice to him after everything that happened when they separated and everything like that. She even seemed to understand he was talented but strange. Like, there was even a level there. So for her to have been basically bad-mouthed by all his little buddies who were all infighting with each other, and what they did to each other even was a lot of backstabbing and different things to try to claim who was the actual heir to Lovecraft and who was the actual one who kind of was his successor, sort of a thing. The one who did an amazing amount of damage that he mentions in here a lot, about the fact that particular guy basically tried to run everybody else out that had any sort of connection to Lovecraft, and he even went after Lovecraft's wife, basically trying to get what amounted to an NDA where she could not say anything about her marriage to Lovecraft and everything like that. And this dude was just, he's the one who started Arkham. It's Edith, I think his name is. Anyway, he's the one who started Arkham Publishing and really did a lot of disservice in messing with his actual writing and what he actually kind of, the way he wrote and different things, and the mythos that goes all around Lovecraft and different stuff. He had a great deal to do with getting that all kind of going a weirder way than initially the Lovecrafts, when you read his actual writings, they actually do. So you kind of have that one to thank for sort of being very aggressive in going after his writings and changing probably what Lovecraft was even looking to do. But Sonia Greene, his wife, really, she comes out of this, and you've got to hand it to Poole that she comes out of this looking cool as all get out, and that she really was kind of done a disservice by all of this dude's friends and all these people who kind of interloped and got involved in their marriage, got involved in, well, we just want him to be our best friend, and we just want this and that, and Derleth. Derleth is the one who liked to bungle everything up and go aggressively after everybody with lawyers. He had one of the friends, I think Barlow is the one that really he kind of wanted to be his successor, but Derleth got in there and ended up kind of bullying him into giving rights to stuff. It's so messy. It's so messy. Everything with Lovecraft is so messy. And it's a weird thing, because Lovecraft did create something that feels entirely new in his writing, and it does hold up, and it is something that I think should be, if not celebrated, at least acknowledged for the contribution that it has to horror fiction and just fiction in general. But, and I've seen some reviews that kind of blame Poole for saying, well, he kind of said that he makes an argument that sort of like, well, other writers at the time were racist too, but they were! I don't have as much issue as a bunch of reviewers had of Poole with this book. And I don't know why they had such an issue with Poole in this book, because this book seemed very even-handed. He did not excuse anything that Lovecraft said or did. If anything, all he did was defend the women around Lovecraft's life, to basically say, yeah, it wasn't really their fault that he was such a weird strange person of contradictions. It was not their doing. And I don't know, that seemed to ruffle some feathers in a lot of the reviews I read, basically saying, well, he was excusing Lovecraft. I don't think he was excusing Lovecraft at all. He was basically saying Lovecraft was what he chose to be. And that could be a virulently unpleasant, hateful dude when it comes to his viewpoints about things. And he just had this weird, it's like he wanted to be aristocracy when that really wasn't even a thing anymore. And I don't know. I just have a hard time not justifying, but I have a hard time kind of matching up Lovecraft's work. And the thing about the, like the art but not the artist type of thing, that's a hard thing to do. Especially when the whole Lovecraftian stuff is just so ingrained in a person who is not a really pleasant person. And had so many flaws on his own and so much weirdness on his own. That's a hard thing to do. And I find that kind of disingenuous in the fact that people would sit around and say, well, it's just the art, love the art. Well, I've seen plenty of stuff where Lovecraft is turned into, there's even like little animated movies where Lovecraft is a character as like a little kid, and people with Lovecraft tattoos, and Lovecraft just being, he's a character in, like, I've seen horror movies where he's a character in it and different things, just sort of like you see F. Scott Fitzgerald in different 20s stuff as like a character. And I don't know, there's a weird, you don't see people with F. Scott Fitzgerald like tattoos and stuff though. And there's a weird thing when you get with Poe and Lovecraft, because they are in such a niche thing that they have their own sort of cult following of the person. And you kind of have to really evaluate that the person themselves had a lot of problems and are problematic. And it's just one of those things. And I think this is a very, very good biography that does very even-handedly mention what Lovecraft's issues were and sort of the reasons that his mother kind of was the way she was and his family sort of was the way it was. But I don't think it gives any excuses for Lovecraft, which is why it was weird that the reviews I was finding was a lot of times saying, which he's giving Lovecraft excuses. I don't think he was in anything about it. And it's just basically saying here were some reasons why his family was the way it fell apart, and he was a strange man. I don't think he was strange in the way that there was anything criminal about his strangeness at all, whereas Poe, you can get a little bit like, there was a 13-year-old. But with Lovecraft, it was a strangeness that was just strange. So it's one of those things. And people who are really into Lovecraft, I would encourage people to evaluate him as a person. And I do understand that Lovecraftian horror is just its own kind of genre now and has kind of been taken over in different ways and by some successors and different things. But Lovecraft is still, so you still call it Lovecraftian horror, is so much involved in it and does have such a cult following around it just based off of him. It does do people good, I think, to know things about the actual person that are more fair to his family. Poole mentions a couple other biographers that were more contemporaries of Lovecraft, and how they really kind of gave a drubbing to the women around him because it was a whole boys club, and they were going to blame everything on the women around everybody at that point. So this is a very, very good biography. It's probably the best one I've ever seen about Lovecraft, and maybe the fairest one I've ever seen about Lovecraft. And if I had to read one, I would say this is the one to go with, because he really delves into the influence of Lovecraft too, and why you cannot just divorce the work from the person anymore. And I think that's a fair statement. So this biography was a lot more in-depth than I expected, and brings even more questions, and maybe not confusion, but at least facets to things you have to consider when it comes to people like Lovecraft and the man himself, who was just a weird little man with some good writing and some terrible ideas about just life in general. But anyway, it is a biography that is well worth reading if you are interested in anything along those lines.